Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank Professor Chatsi for giving me an opportunity to present some part of the work that I've been doing in the last 3 years under the Divert project. So the seminar today would focus on development of sensors using MXene nanomaterials, and also a part of it would focus on some of the computational models that we have built, multi-scale mechanical models, while we are still in the process of building the electromechanical models for these sensors. Let me give you a brief background of what MXenes are and why we got into this. So structural health monitoring has become very critical for the life cycle management of most of the structures today. And one important aspect that we wanted to focus was on developing sensors and smart coating, more of a paint that you could put on a structure, which could also tell you what's happening with the structure and inside the structure. So we embarked on a journey which is probably 10 years old, where my seniors worked on carbon nanotubes and graphene. We were looking at materials that can be well processed and used for these coatings, and MXenes was one of the options that we found could be promising for sensor development and also for use in structural health monitoring applications. So going forward, to give you a small background of what MXenes are two-dimensional nanomaterial. It's a family of two-dimensional nanomaterials. The first reported MXene was the titanium carbide MXene, which is basically very good with hydrophilic behavior, and that actually propelled its growth in the last 10 years. There are many unique properties, but hydrophilicity helps it disperse well in liquids, including polymers as well as colloidal solutions. And this led to a lot of rapid development of processes, manufacturing processes, which has given us many sensors in the last few years. And it has really good elasticity. Young's moduli close to about 330 gigapascal of single layer, and a good conductivity as well. So typically a MXene film, which is few microns thick, can have resistance of about 10 ohms. Which is quite good for some experiments, but you would also want them to have higher resistivity. So you would add polymers to increase the resistance. And compared to carbon nanotubes, which actually form agglomerates or coagulate to form a group of nanomaterials, due to good dispersion and hydrophilicity, they can be well dispersed, and you could have uniform structures being built for them. They have better conductivity than graphene oxide, and these are some initial points which actually led us to work on MXenes. And the complexities that we see with MXenes are from nanoscale, because you need to model them from the nanoscale to the macro scale to have them respond well, and also compare the numerical models with the experimental results. Also, because of really good electromechanical properties, you would want to have multi-domain models which could be built. All of this is to eventually build sensors which would also have virtual models which can be integrated into the digital twin frameworks. And the seminar today would focus more on the sensor development aspect of MXenes. This would be an initial step where we could discuss more on how these are used for applications and also integration into digital twins. A brief background, not diving too much into the chemistry of the system. So MXenes, the MX represents transition metals, and the X represents the carbide and nitrides, which are actually formed. What you see here is a typical single layer titanium carbide MXene, where you'll have 3 layers of titanium and 2 layers of carbide. And it also has surface terminations. The surface terminations are basically oxides, fluorides, and hydroxides, which actually gives it the property of hydrophilicity to mix well with water, with polymer, etc. So the focus today would be on just one type of MXene, that is titanium carbide, Ti3C2. But there's a host of other options that have been developed. A lot of other synthesis have led to discovery of many other MXenes, which will have both magnetic, electromagnetic properties, and properties which can be tailored into whatever sensors that we want. Recently, the plasmonic properties of these materials are also making a lot of impact in developing optoelectronic sensors and also electronic devices which are being made. Over the last 10 years, the applications have been multiple. There has recently been an artificial kidney which has been designed with MXene membranes to filter the blood from impurities. there's water purification processes which is used, but our focus has been on sensors and also energy harvesting using these materials. And typically, a MXene 2D layer, which is a single layer of MXene, has about Young's moduli of 330 gigapascal. These are comparisons between a similar type of experiment performed on the atomic force microscope. That gives you a comparison with graphene and reduced graphene oxide, etc. Our focus on MXene was because also of the processability. We could print them. Currently, we have made screen printed samples, inkjet printed samples, also spin coated samples, which can be used. This allows you to rapidly prototype, allows you to have rapid prototype systems, which can also be tested immediately. But during the last 10 years, there's been a lot of development which has standardized the synthesis processes and also how these MXene flakes can be controlled, both with their topology as well as properties that can lead to various applications that we have. Getting to the main topic of the seminar, where we are using MXene nanomaterials for structural health monitoring, three important parameters that we considered that needs a lot of focus and also due diligence is the sensitivity of these materials and the sensors that we develop, because you would also be competing with commercial sensors which are really good and have been established for a long time. The stability of these materials, most carbon-based nanomaterials like graphene or carbon nanotubes are almost immune to changes in the environment if they're manufactured and fabricated well, but new materials, when they develop, will have stability issues for a period of 90 or 180 days. And you would want to prolong this so that your sensors can be used for long duration on structures. The durability is something that is a critical aspect, because you would not want your sensors to be replaced while you're using a system like offshore wind turbine multiple times, because the cost of replacement would also be very high. So these are some of the aspects that we dwelt on before we could get into the fine details of the work. So building we started off building numerical models first before we could do some experiments. The time of synthesis and processing these materials took considerable time, which also gave us some time for numerical modeling. Most of the properties at sub-micron scale were being reported by 2018, and we'd also have enough input from the literature that could be used to build models from micro to macro scale. And the initial choice of methods of modeling from micro to macro scale was something which is very standard and also being used for other nanomaterials. So we did use a Fe² method where we are using finite element method at 2 scales. And we assume a homogenized system where you would have periodic boundary condition on the representative volume element that you have. This also is from the empirical observations that we made from the experiments that we performed. You would have a spin-coated sample which would have orientations of these MXenes in random directions, which could also be one of the outcomes. But the consistent method which has been used for the last 10 years is a vacuum filtration method, where you will have a film of filter which will absorb, or which will actually remove the water from the colloidal solution, and all the MXenes get settled down on the sample to form a uniform structure, which can then be peeled off and used for devices. So our target was to model this, and we did come up with some deterministic models to start off with, and out of which we also looked at how intercalation or mixing of MXene with polymer would affect your models, where you would have different distances between the flakes and multilayers, which would also contribute to the variation in their properties, mechanical properties here. So when we also subjected them to the Hin-Mandel condition so that it could have the overall results that could be matched for some experimental outcomes that we had, we did find that they were performing, the numerical models were performing better than the analytical models which are used for nanocomposites, but were not in great agreement. The order of magnitude would be same, but the error of estimation would be very high. And the reasons for this are also linked to the chemistry of the material and how it reacts with the polymer. The results that you see are for MXene epoxy, where you have some amount of agreement with the experimental results that have been published. But for a polyvinyl alcohol polymer, the experimental results were almost twice or more than twice compared to our numerical models. So the root cause of such problems are when we model nanomaterials with composites, with polymer, you will have a bonding a chemical bonding that takes place. So we had to perform a molecular simulation called the reaction force field simulations, where we would have the molecular level simulations of MXene with epoxy resin chain as well as polyvinyl alcohol chains. The number of chemical bonds that are formed with epoxy resin and MXene is quite less compared to polyvinyl alcohol. This leads to understanding that there are more bonds formed on the surface, resulting in a stronger interface region. The interface region between MXene and polymer would play a major role in further development of these models. And also at this point, we did stop on our modeling processes because we wanted some samples to get more empirical examples and ideas of how we could model. From that, we have now understood that there is a resistance that the MXenes could offer, and we could add them into the electromechanical models. But there is also something called as a tunneling effect between 2 or 3 MXenes, which are very close to each other, where electrons jump from one layer to another. So modeling this is something which is still in process. There are some results that graphenes have already for tunneling effect, but we are still trying to understand how they could be modeled for MXenes. Moving on to some experimental results so that we could start off with some understanding of how this material works. In reality, the sensor that you see is basically the black part here, which is then subjected to a packaging process where you will not have them exposed to a lot of oxygen or humidity. This is to reduce the effect of instability that would come in to the sample. This is a classic shock tube experiment that we performed. Probably I've shown this in the Divert project multiple times. But one of the reasons that we use this as a standard experiment is most people in the industry, when they develop sensors for particularly pressure sensors, use this as a test setup so that you have repeatable impact of forces on the sample. So the rupture of the diaphragm in the tube would actually release a shock wave which would travel through the tube, hitting your sample, and this can be repeated multiple times to understand how the response of the material is. This helps both in calibration, understanding the response of the material for the load, and also building on this, we could have devices which can be built. From the diagram here, you would also see some sensors. These are resistive sensors, which are actually measuring the flow of shock through the tube. And this also gives you the input signal that is applied on the MXene sample. So you have both an input as an output that can be compared. So the input coming from a piezoresistive sensor, while the MXene outcome is also present. We focus more on, I would say, dynamic response time than other properties that we need for developing a specification table for a sensor. This being a lot of sensors which are manufactured also need to have their bandwidth being established before they could be put into the market. So we did find that these materials have really good response times. For the shock tube experiment, we had it in microseconds, but for a ball drop experiment, we had it in milliseconds. So this was the initial stage of comparison we started off with the specifications that we have from commercial sensors. The PCB Piezotronics commercial sensor is basically a ceramic PZT type sensor that is piezoelectric in nature, and the next one is the piezoresistive type silicon on insulator type of sensor, which is also used in the same shock tube for calibration. We did find that the performance of the response times were really good, and we also found the response signals to be quite promising when compared to the PCB sensor, where the one on the top, the blue one, is basically from the piezoelectric sensor that is used in the same test setup, and the one from the piezoresistive is also given. And one of the outcomes from the studies that we made was that it was quite possible that there is some kind of piezoelectric or a flexoelectric effect with these samples of 2D materials. which is still under investigation that we've been doing the last 1 year. We didn't want these samples to be put into a market phase where we could have them commercialized, because we would want them to be going through a long repeatability cycle. So we've been testing them for the last 1 year with our collaborators, and for the last 1 year, the response of the material seems to be quite good. And we've prepared a lot more samples in the long duration, which could be repeated and tested again and again. And going further, we did perform a standard lead break test, which is used to measure the change, the acoustic emission event in a metallic sample. This can also be done with an acrylic rod, which is quite standardized, and an ASTM test specification exists for them. But we did try it with a metallic substance so that we could have some close to reality experiments that we do in our lab. So we did find that the result that you see on the right bottom corner is basically a hammer hitting the metal piece multiple times, which gets captured. While this is one crude experiment that we performed, but with the pencil lead break test, we did have some results coming out without any signal processing. The initial phase, we didn't want to have a lot of signal processing to see if the gain that we have or the kind of response that we have is quite considerable, and what kind of amplifiers could be used. And in this process, we found the response time and the fault times to be really promising in the range of milliseconds. But it also requires us to characterize the material, the piezoelectric coefficients, and see how they could be related to the theoretical values and the propagation of wave that happens through the medium. So these are initial results that I wanted to show to all of you, because a lot of us work with ultrasound and non-destructive evaluation. We are looking at times when we could have these sensors coated onto the sample and then results coming out of them. The initial test that we did in the last 2-3 weeks, so that I can get some samples here to test them out, is basically using the liquid form MXene, vacuum filtering them through the standard process we have, making the films out of them and drying it in vacuum to get the final devices that we make. So this is a sample which has glass fiber epoxy base, upon which we have a silver epoxy electrode being printed and then the sample attached to it. So the variation in any force applied on this gets captured in a change of resistance. But for a piezoelectric material, you'd want to change in voltage that would come out of it. So that is something that we are still investigating. All these samples are characterized. So basically, we don't just make the sample and then use them for a device. We need to characterize them with XRD analysis to see if they have the same kind of XRD peaks, which are repeatable with multiple sets of MXene that we build. One of the example that I see here is a tube which is filled with MXene ink. So this can be used, and we are currently building some sensors which can be spin coated and also screen printed. So this is possible with the change in the concentration of the liquid that we have. So it's a mixture of chemistry, physics, engineering, all of this together to get to a sensor stage and then develop them for the application that we are looking at. There are a lot of uncertainties. It's not that we have something which is very perfect for us to use. The uncertainties might come from the experimental manufacturing processes that we have. There might be uncertainties with the synthesis processes that we'll have encounter. And all of this will also be our inputs that would get into the computational models. A lot of information for the computational model is still unavailable, and we still need to do a lot of experiments for them. A basic example is the interface properties. How would one MXene layer, when pulled out of polymer surrounding, would have the shearing forces at the surfaces? So these are some tests that still need to be performed either using molecular dynamic simulations or through experiments. And all of this culminates to one major question that all of us will have. How reliable are these? Are they repeatable? Can this be used again? So one of the issues that MXenes had for the last 10 years, and the challenge that was for all of us to solve in the last 10 years, was to increase the stability of the sample. So there are now chemical and physical methods which will help us prolong the stability more than 90 days. But also enough simulations can be done at molecular level to understand what are the best processes to increase the reliability of these samples. And this is an initial phase of our development of the sensor, where we could use them apply them to structures, see how they react, either for strain, either for the forcing, impact forcing that the structures have. But this is still the start. We have a long way to go to get them to be applied for industrial applications, where the initial step is to have much evolved and useful processes which are acid-free, because most centers would not have such acid-based processes for us to manufacture MXenes. So that is one aspect of it, utilizing the uncertainties that we identify into the numerical models that we build is something that we would want to do in the near future. Building these multi-scale, multi-domain models would also help us integrate them into the digital twin framework, where you would also have the virtual twin of the sensor, which is used in a structure that is being built. With the multifunctional sensors that we're building, we've been able to measure strain, pressure, shock wave propagation, a bit of acoustic emission, which we want to still explore. Impact has been done with ball drop tests. So we do have a lot of capabilities that can be built into one sensor and used together. But this is just the start, because we are looking at just one MXene, that's titanium carbide, and the amount of research that can be done with other MXenes is still a lot of work left for us to look into. Maybe about 10 to 20 years of research that can go ahead with. So I would like to thank you for your time and patient hearing. I would also be happy to answer any questions that would come about. I wanted this presentation to be a bit short because I didn't want to take a lot of your time during your lunch. So hopefully you could have some interaction on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shreyas.